Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the 2018 INC Roundtable on Brazil nuts. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, I'd like to thank Irene and the rest of the INC team for inviting me to moderate this conversation after such an unusual and interesting Brazil nut year. Without further ado, our panelists are from closest to farthest from me. Edward Dannon. Edward is a director at Voicevale, responsible for Brazil nuts, quinoa, and chia, and specifically the manager of a Bolivian Brazil nuts factory, Green Forest Products, and their La Paz office. Jose Padilla, or Pepe, is commercial director of Amazonas Manutata, a Brazil nut processing and exporting company with 3 facilities based in Bolivia and Peru, attending customers in all 5 continents, related sales, negotiations, logistics, and post-sale services. Finally, we have Mr. Casimiro Florenzano Filho. Casimiro is the 3rd generation of Italian immigrants in Amazonia. He founded Exportadora Florenzano Limitada along with his father in 1988. He works together with the people of the Amazon forest from collection to processing of the Brazil nut crop. This is basically what we're going over. Here's everybody. I'm going to be very quick in terms of going over the numbers and then move on. Very quickly, I'm Richard Rosenblatt. I'm the vice president of the Richard Franco Agency. My grandfather, Richard, started the brokering tree nuts in the 1940s and was followed by my father, David Rosenblatt. We've been around tree nuts for a very long time. I've been attending this conference since I was a little boy. We're the 3rd generation and have been focusing on Brazil nuts, cashews, and max. So I'm not going to get into detail on the numbers before we start, but these are the numbers. I think there's really one number here that's important, which is last year's crop, the 2017-18 crop, if you will, but really the 2017 crop, was about half or less of what prior year's crops were. And the current crop that's being utilized now is returned to approximate levels of 2 years ago. I'm not going to fight over the details. The magnitude is all that's really important. We went from X to less than half X back to X. So without further ado, we'll start. Pepe, can you tell us a little bit about what happened last year to the crop?
Well, nice to meet you here. Last year we faced a dramatic decreasing quantity in our supply. We have a shortage in all the Amazon forest, no only in a specific place. This situation, as per people in the business, never ever happened before. We face a reduction of about 40 or 50% of the regular size crop. It depends if we consider the quantity of containers exported for the current crop or we added the quantity of the previous crop. This situation was partially expected for all the companies, mostly, but nobody will be able to predict the real size of the shortage. Everybody will become surprised because at the end. And also face in previous crop another important phenomenon was the appearance of a new player in the game, a new player called Korea that suddenly appears purchasing more or less about 15 to 20% of the worldwide demand. Though maybe this phenomenon was be camouflated because the shortage of the crop, that maybe this was the explanation of some of the movements we faced last year.
Very good. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Pepe. Edward, can you tell us a little bit about how the world market responded to the shortage Pepe discussed?
Yeah, sure. Discussing markets in general, the Brazil nut market has many different markets, as we know. There's the market in the jungle, deep in. The wild Brazil nut is not harvested, it's not farmed, it's collected off the ground at one point in the season, and that's the first market. So that's the collectors. Then the second market is from the collectors to the factories. And the last market, well, the penultimate market is to the exporters to make it into the world. And then it's the final consumers. And each one of those markets behave differently this year, differently to ways they have ever behaved. The first market continuously went up. The lack of material was quite clear only from around February, March time, and therefore demand kept pushing prices up. It was a demand-driven push. Secondly, factories who had pre-sold sometimes earlier on or the previous year, they faced significant challenges as their pricing structure was completely out of line to what was reality. So they had a very hard year for pretty much all of them, but luckily have appeared to have made it through into this year. Then the importers had their struggle to either achieve their contracts, which they had already pre-sold, and that market continually went up. And this is purely lack of supply to the demand. So now there's the demand side of the equation, the final users. So what did they do? We found some users took the decisions to completely remove Brazil nuts from the shelves. They decided removing it from the shelves would impact demand less than keeping them on the shelves at a higher price, which was the other option people went with. Some people left it on the shelf. Actually, some people maintained the price, never changed it, whereas others increased the price on the shelves. Then we found a lot of people changed their recipes. They did the maths between reprinting packaging or buying Brazil nuts and decided that it was better to change packaging. And that will be the fight for this year. What Pepe mentioned is actually very interesting. Around middle of the way through last year, whilst others were reducing their demand by changing packaging, by putting the price up so demand went down, the Koreans started to buy. And this is a country which consumed 70 tons the year before, so it's about 5 containers or so. Suddenly, as Pepe says, consumed a significant amount of the crop available then. They will be an interesting player going forward and should have an effect on the market.
Very interesting. Casimiro, it's not really addressed here. We adjusted the numbers for it, but the Brazilian market has become internal market has become a pretty important player, representing a pretty large percentage of consumption over the last decade or so. What impact did the changing market that Pepe described, how did that affect the consumption within Brazil?
We had a carryover from 2016 crop, and this quantity supplied the market in the first 3 months in the year. And then when it really proved that we had no crop, and there's very, very small crop, and they started to import some quantities from Peru and Bolivia, and then the price increased too much. After the second half of the year, the consumption started to reduce dramatically because the price is very high. And then until now, this consumption is very reduced. Also, we have political and economic situations not very good in this time, and then this very, very big reduction in our market. We can see because of the new crop coming, and this consumption no go up again. We have a reduced price from last year, but the consumption is coming down until now.
Very good. So, right, even though we're seeing lower pricing in the Brazilian market, we're still seeing levels consumption levels reflecting the higher prices of last year. Edward, given the difficulties of 2017, or at least the fluctuations of 2017, what were the expectations coming into 2018 before we got kind of a prognosis of the actual crop? But, you know, what were people thinking coming into this year's crop?
We've been discussing how day on day things can change in any market, and I think it was the case for us really. Towards the end of last year, we saw a massive decrease in demand throughout the whole of Europe and the US. We saw the US with high-priced stocks, Europe full warehouses with customers calling off very late, so therefore we expected our stock, even from the minimal production we had last year, to carry forward to Q2, Q3 this year, which would have been perfectly fine for the new crop arrivals. Then what happened was people's warehouses started to empty. There were, sorry to harp on about it, but the Koreans started to air freight containers both from origin and from the US, from Europe, to their market, which, by the way, is a boom market in terms of if they find a product they like, they go for it and they go big, and it can last for some time and then reduce again. But even if that was the case with Brazil nuts, their starting point is very low at 70 tons. So even if they come down, it will still be a player. So whilst we saw good stocks, suddenly we saw no stocks. We then also saw that the harvest started early, and it could be for a few reasons. One reason could be that people were out of work for 6 months of the year. One thing to visualize is that the Brazil nut product supports a huge amount of people in an area who don't have another income. So in supporting this Brazil nuts, we're supporting a lot of these people without another choice. And it was through that lack of choice that they went in hope of a collection starting early. This early would be around November time, or even slightly before. And they were there, so the crop started much earlier. So we had the effect of warehouses being empty, yet being replaced, but with a higher price, because the price was still relatively high. So at the beginning of the year, we were pessimistic in terms of could it sustain a relatively high price. But because warehouses emptied quickly, product replaced itself quickly, we did face a fall, but since then it's been relatively stable.
Very interesting. Casimiro, Edward mentioned that the collection started very early this year because of the high prices. Is there, can you tell us a little bit more about any changes, anything special about the collection situation at origin coming off of such high prices last year?
The collectors are very happy because they need to work. And then in Brazil, collectors nuts, Brazil nuts, is cultural. In many areas, they live in the jungle and they need to work. The price, the first price of the crop, when the crop begins this year, is automatically reducing. And depends of the market, the price will reducing. And then, as they need this job, they normally go to the florist and collect the nuts.
Very good. Pepe, on that same note, did you see any big differences between the collectors and the sourcing in Peru and Bolivia versus Brazil, or one versus the other? And I'll throw another curveball at you and ask you if you can comment about the pre-financing of the crop, and if the change in the prices had any effect on the collectors in that regard.
Well, situation in three countries are different. Mostly explained because Korea's appearance. In Peru, they are living their own play because the difference between the import taxes in Korea Peruvian goods have to pay 6% of taxes compared Bolivian and Brazilian goods that have to pay 30%. So this huge difference makes that at the beginning, all the Koreans were looking to Peruvian goods. And because the difference in the productions between the countries, Koreans later faced to Bolivian goods. No? So the same situation is explained for Brazilians. We know that the Bolivian exports are more or less 80–85% of the worldwide supply. And this situation makes that for the collectors, also for the shippers, all became expectating what is happening for the season, explained because Korea mostly, and because the situation of the traditional market also, we are talking about Europe and USA, that it's running mostly normal, talking about the quantity of shipments being export from origin. We'll see what will going to happen in close future. As Edward was talking about, mostly all of the crop is already done. We have a good percentage of the production already processed, already shipped, and we'll see what we're going to happen next month. No?
Richard, can I take your point on the pre-finance?
Of course, please.
Talking from the perspective of a Bolivian factory, Green Forest, there's various models of which you collect your raw material. And the method that Richard's referring to is pre-financing. So at the beginning of the harvest, you negotiate with your collectors a price, and this year it was very quickly, they wanted a significantly higher price, but it was agreed, and everyone went in very early to collect. The challenge for that is you can agree a price in November, December, and January, and you give money in advance. They go off and collect it, and it can take 1, 2, 3 months to arrive, but you've already agreed the price which you're going to pay. So once the material arrives to the factory, the person says, well, I've made it, and I've made it early, and I hope you're very pleased, but this is the price which we agreed. Even though the price today is significantly different, the export market has reduced, let's say from December time, from $6 down past $5, so $1 per pound difference. You still need to pay the price agreed. So whilst you've pre-financed to get your goods, it's not necessarily, and you have to, all factories have to follow this model. There's no way of doing it without. It's challenging, because then in a falling global market, you're stuck with much higher price stock.
You know, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and ask Casimiro, based on, we kind of started on a question for you, which is, so this pre-financing situation with the prices adjusting and a lot of risk in the market, how have shippers responded to the great uncertainty in the market? When you had a historically high price last year and the expectations of lower prices going forward, how have the shippers handled this?
In the last 10 years, the Brazilian shippers decided to work only with domestic market. Good price, good market, good quantity. And when they see this new situation that we have a normal crop, they trying to get certification to come back to the exportation again. And then we can see offer today from many companies from Brazil in the market.
Very good. I'm going to jump back to you, Edward. So we're 6 months in to the current crop, give or take. As you said, it started a little earlier than normal. What's been the reaction of the market over the first 6 months? I know you talked a little bit about how stocks moved a little bit quicker than expected at the beginning of the year, but 6 months in, we're getting into a bit more steady state. how does the market seem to be responding?
Difficult question to answer, really, but in terms of, if we look at the order of the largest importers, as of today, Korea is the largest consumer of Brazil nuts. They consume the amount of the USA and Germany combined, who are the second and third largest, and then UK is the fourth, and normally it's the UK who's in the top running. So the UK market responded by not buying as much as they have done. The Korean market responded by buying more than they did in previous years, in the previous year when they started, and much more than they ever had. And the US market followed similar lines to the UK one, where they reduced their demand, shipped out. But we see signs now, signs of a brighter future for Europe as well. Germany is consistently consuming. The UK appears to be relisting, changing their recipes to put Brazil nuts back in. The Korean market is moving less from a let's buy everything we can to hand-to-mouth buying as they've seen pricing coming down. Even with that hand-to-mouth buying, they're still the largest importer. So I see a good future, and it's important to have a good future for this product. If you look at our total, we're 29,000 tons. That's 2 weeks' worth of almond shipments. It's a tiny commodity, but has a huge impact on the wider world. So I see a good future for it, for sure.
That's great. You answered my next question,
Oh,
so speed right along. Pepe, how about you? Do you have any guidelines on how people trying to operate in the Brazil nut business should handle their, any guidelines for how to manage and what to look out for over the next rest of the 2018 crop and maybe going into 2019?
Well, one thing that we have to remember is we are talking about Brazil nut is the only one nut growing and being collected in wild. We are very, very small business compared to other nuts. We are talking about just 24,000 tons in average. And the main thing is we can increase this quantity of volume of Brazil nuts. It's not possible in the short time and even not in the middle time. Because one tree of Brazil nuts takes more or less 12 to 14 years to grow and start producing in commercial sizes. So if some situation like Korea or some like other important market will appear very close, especially in Asia where they have a lot of population, we are very concerned related how it will affect the relationship between the demand and the supply. Because we are not able to respond against a big new demand. Or also we have to consider about there is no other risk like with other products, for example, that suddenly China, for example, will appear with new plantations of Brazil nuts. It's not possible. So any movement in the demand will always have the same quantity of 24,000 tons to cover. So when we're going to decide what we'll have to do in this year or next year, we have to take this situation in mind. We only have 24,000 tons in average that to cover anything happening in the market.
Perfect. Casimiro, Pepe, I think, got onto the very important point that this, unlike our other commodities, is really a fixed supply. There's variations on how much it's collected, but the trees give what they will give, and planting isn't really a possibility. Do you have any other points or things that we should be looking out for in terms of supply over the next year or maybe for the next year's crop?
In my point of view, we should have for the future some regular crop. And for Brazil nut, in my opinion, is important buy and sell. Never do any speculate because it's difficult to know what could happen. And then it's important that you buy the material and sell. in my opinion.
I think that's excellent. I mean, I think the difficulty of knowing what we have is something that's, you know, certainly not unique, but maybe the degree of uncertainty in dealing with a big forest and such a few number of trees per hectare makes the prediction much more difficult going forward. We're going to switch to the questions we have. The first one is, did it pop up? I did what I'm supposed to do. I can read it if it's...
It's been sent, so it'll come up any second.
Okay, well, anyway, I'll read it for now. I think this is, let's start with you, Pepe. Which effect did the disastrous financial last year's crop have on the number of exporters still remaining?
Again, please.
What effect did the disastrous last year's crop have on the number of exporters? I guess how many exporters are in South America exporting the crop? Was there effect?
Did anyone go bankrupt last year?
In bankrupt?
Yeah.
No, so in fact there was no that situation. No, it's everybody have to face how to solve the problem. That previous year was not a common year. I guess everybody was able to understand the situation. This was not a problem of just one company. This was a general problem of the industry. No? So all the players at both sides of the supply chain were able to understand the situation and more or less find the middle point in order to avoid any dramatical crisis for anyone.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true. Actually, I think even though this question was phrased in such a way, Casimiro, are you seeing new entrants to the Brazil nut market in 2018 or for this current crop? Any new supply coming online? I'm asking a leading question. My understanding is that we're seeing the number of suppliers increasing over the last year. Can you tell us anything more about that?
In the world?
Yeah, in South America, yeah.
Yeah, I believe that in future, I see that is increased the business, and then I see that we have new buyers in Korea and other place. Okay. We see that has a new buyers in the market, and then Korea is one country that every year increase the quantities, and I think it could see a good opportunity for do a business in the future.
Which has been drawing in quite a few new players into the market.
Yeah.
Well, I think with that, I think our time is up. I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists, Edward, Pepe, and Mr. Casimiro, and wish everybody the best of luck at the convention. Thank you.